Martin Luther King, Jr., the Prophet of Justice. Introduction. The thunder before silence. The rain hammered against the windows of Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, as if the heavens themselves were protesting what was about to unfold. It was April 3rd, 1968, and inside the packed church, thousands of people waited in the humid darkness, their voices rising in hymns that had carried their ancestors through centuries of suffering. Thunder rolled across the Mississippi sky, each crack a reminder that nature, like history, moved in waves both gentle and violent. Martin Luther King, Jr. had not planned to speak that night. Exhausted from years of struggle, worn down by death threats that arrived daily, haunted by a premonition he could not name, he had asked Ralph Abernathy to take his place. But the people wanted their prophet. They wanted the voice that had shaken the conscience of a nation. They wanted the man who had stood before 250,000 souls in Washington and painted a dream so vivid that even those who hated him could see its outlines. So, King came. He climbed the steps to the pulpit, his face showing the weight of 13 years spent battling an enemy that wore 1,000 masks. The crowd erupted as he took his position, their applause crashing like those waves outside, relentless and full of hope. He gripped the lectern and began to speak, his voice starting low, building slowly as it always did, gathering strength from some reservoir deep within his spirit. He spoke of struggles past and struggles yet to come. He spoke of Pharaoh and the Exodus, of dark nights and promised lands. His words climbed higher, lifting the congregation from their seats, pulling them towards something they could almost touch. Then, near the end, his voice changed. It became softer, almost tender, as if he were sharing a secret he had carried alone for too long. He told them he had been to the mountaintop. He told them he had looked over and seen the promised land. He told them he might not get there with them, but they, as a people, would reach that sacred ground. His voice cracked with emotion as thunder punctuated his prophecy. The people wept. They did not fully understand what they were hearing, but they felt it in their bones, the way you feel winter coming before the first frost arrives. 24 hours later, Martin Luther King, Jr. would stand on a motel balcony and face his final sunset. A single bullet would tear through the April evening and silence the most powerful voice America had produced in a century. But before we follow him to that balcony, before we witness the moment when a movement lost its shepherd, we must journey back to where it all began, to a house on Auburn Avenue, to a boy who would grow up to shake the foundations of an empire built on oppression. This is the story of how one man, armed only with words and an unshakable faith in human dignity, challenged the greatest evil of his time and won. This is the story of courage in the face of hatred, of hope in the presence of despair, of a dream that refused to die even when the dreamer fell. This is the story of Martin Luther King, Jr., and it begins not with thunder, but with the quiet determination of a family who refused to bow. Chapter 1. Auburn Avenue's Son. Clang. Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, had a name among those who knew it best. They called it Sweet Auburn, and the nickname carried more than affection. It carried pride, defiance, and possibility. This was Black Wall Street, where black-owned businesses lined the sidewalks, where black doctors treated black patients in black hospitals, where black money circulated through black hands in a community that had built its own economy within the walls of segregation. The oppressors had tried to cage them with Jim Crow laws, but on Auburn Avenue, Black Atlanta built something magnificent inside that cage. Disrogation's 1929, in a large Victorian house at 501 Auburn Avenue, Alberta Williams King gave birth to her second child. They named him Michael, after his father, but in 1934, after a trip to Europe where Reverend King Sr. encountered the legacy of the 16th century Protestant reformer Martin Luther, both father and son would take that name as their own. History would remember him as Martin Luther King, Jr., but on that January day, He was simply a healthy baby boy, born into a family of preachers and activists who understood both the power of faith and the necessity of resistance. The house on Auburn Avenue stood 3 stories tall, its rooms filled with the sounds of family life and the business of ministry. Martin's maternal grandfather, Adam Daniel Williams, had been pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, a position his father now held. The family lived comfortably by the standards of Black Atlanta, not wealthy but secure, educated, and conscious of their responsibility to their community. Young Martin grew up surrounded by books, by conversations about justice and scripture, by the constant stream of people who came to his father for counsel or aid. But comfort could not shield a black child from the realities of the South in the 1930s. The lessons came early, and they came hard, each one a wound that shaped the man he would become. When Martin was 6 years old, he learned that the world saw him as something less than human. He had been playing regularly with a white boy whose family lived near Auburn Avenue, 2 children who knew nothing of race, only the joy of friendship. Then school began, and the white schools were separate from the black schools, as the law demanded. Non-profits, Martin went to his friend's house as he always had, eager to play. But this time, the boy's mother met him at the door. Her face was hard, her words harder. Her son could no longer play with Martin, she said. They were attending different schools now, and colored children were not welcome in her home. The door closed before Martin could respond. He stood on that porch, 6 years old, trying to understand why the color of his skin had suddenly erased everything he thought he knew about friendship. He ran home with questions that tumbled out between tears. His mother sat him down and told him what every black parent in the South had to tell their children eventually. She told him about slavery, about how black people had been brought to America in chains, forced to build a nation's wealth with their labor and their blood. She told him about the war that ended slavery, but not the hatred behind it. She told him about segregation, about the laws that said he could not drink from certain water fountains, could not sit in certain seats, could not enter certain buildings. She told him that these laws were wrong, that they were evil, but that they were also the reality he would have to navigate every day of his life. But she also told him something else, something that planted a seed that would grow into his life's mission. She told him that he was as good as anyone, that his skin color did not diminish his worth, that he was a child of God with dignity and purpose. She told him never to accept segregation as right, even when he had to live within its boundaries. These words became a compass that pointed toward a destination he could not yet see. Martin's father taught him through action as much as words. Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. was a man of imposing presence and uncompromising principles. He had been born into poverty in rural Georgia, the son of a sharecropper who endured brutal exploitation on land owned by white men who treated black laborers as barely human. Young King Sr. had witnessed his own father's humiliation, had seen the boss cheat his family out of wages, had heard threats when he dared to point out the theft. That experience crystallized something in him. He left the farm at age 18, vowing never to plow another man's field, and walked to Atlanta with nothing but determination and a burning desire for education. He worked his way through Morehouse College and into the pulpit, becoming one of Atlanta's most respected black ministers. But respect did not mean submission. King Sr. stood up to segregation in ways that terrified his family and inspired his children. When a police officer stopped him and addressed him as boy, King Sr. pointed to young Martin and said firmly that this was a boy, but he himself was a man. When a shoe store clerk told them they would have to move to the back of the store to be served, King Sr. refused, declaring they would buy shoes sitting where they were or not buy shoes at all. He walked out with his son and later told Martin that he would never accept the system of segregation, no matter how long he had to live with it. In 1936, when Martin was 7 years old, his father did something that showed him what leadership looked like. King Sr. organized hundreds of black citizens and led them in a march to Atlanta's City Hall to protest restrictions on voting rights. This was not a time when such actions were safe or common, but King Sr. believed that silence was complicity, and he refused to be silent. Young Martin watched his father stand before power and demand justice, and the image burned itself into his memory.
The house on Auburn Avenue was where Martin learned that moral courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. It was where he learned that education was a weapon against ignorance, that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered, that the long arc of history bent toward justice, but only when people grabbed hold of it and pulled. He sang in the church choir, his voice already showing hints of the power it would carry. He memorized hymns and Bible verses with ease, his mind hungry for words and ideas. But he also experienced the shadow that fell across even the brightest childhoods in Black America. On May 18, 1941, Martin sneaked away from his studies to watch a parade. While he was gone, his beloved grandmother suffered a heart attack. By the time he returned home, she was dead. The guilt crashed over him like a wave. He believed his disobedience had caused her death, that God had punished him by taking away someone he loved. The pain was so overwhelming that he twice jumped from a second-story window, though both times he survived without serious injury. His father sat with him in that darkness and helped him understand that guilt and grief were not the same thing, that his grandmother's death was not punishment, but part of the natural cycle that God ordained for all people. Martin struggled with these concepts, wrestling with ideas of fate and responsibility that were too heavy for a child's shoulders. But through the struggle, his faith deepened. He began to see religion not just as a set of rules or rituals, but as a way of understanding suffering and finding purpose within it. As he moved through adolescence, Martin felt the sting of segregation again and again. He attended segregated schools, rode in the backs of buses, watched his father forced to use separate entrances and facilities marked for colored people. But his parents had given him armor against the poison of hatred. They had taught him that the problem was not with him, but with the society that treated him as inferior. They had shown him that resistance was possible, that dignity could be maintained even in degrading circumstances, that change, though slow and costly, was achievable. Disregard Booker T. Washington High School, Martin joined the debate team and discovered he had a gift for public speaking. His voice, already deep and resonant beyond his years, commanded attention. His vocabulary, built through years of voracious reading, gave him tools to articulate complex ideas with clarity and power. When he spoke, people listened. He won a statewide oratory contest in Valdosta, Georgia, delivering a speech about the Negro and the Constitution that impressed the judges and thrilled his teachers. But the bus ride home from that triumph turned sour. The driver, seeing that white passengers needed seats, ordered Martin and his teacher to give up their seats and stand. They had paid their fares just like everyone else, but the law said black passengers must yield to white passengers whenever necessary. For 90 miles, Martin and his teacher stood in the aisle while white passengers sat in the seats they had vacated. The humiliation burned. Here he had just won an award for his eloquent words about justice and equality, and now he was forced to stand like cargo because of the color of his skin. That ride crystallized something in the teenager. He realized that speeches and awards meant nothing if the fundamental structure of society remained unchanged. He realized that the battle was not just against individual prejudice, but against systems and laws designed to enforce inequality. He realized that he could either accept this reality or spend his life trying to destroy it. The choice was forming in his mind, though he did not yet know what shape it would take.
In 1944, at the age of 15, Martin entered Morehouse College through a special program designed to fill classrooms depleted by World War II. He was young, brilliant, and uncertain about his future. He knew he had gifts, but he was not sure he wanted to follow his father and grandfather into the ministry. The church sometimes seemed too otherworldly, too focused on the next life, while people suffered in this one. He wanted to make a difference in the tangible world, to address the injustices he saw every day. But Morehouse began to change his thinking. The college's president, Benjamin Mays, became a mentor and model for what a minister could be. Mays preached a gospel that did not separate spiritual salvation from social justice, that saw fighting for civil rights as sacred work. Under Mays's influence, Martin began to understand that religion could be a force for transformation in this world, not just preparation for the next. He began to see the church as a potential instrument of change, a place where moral authority could be channeled into concrete action. During the summer before his senior year, Martin worked on a tobacco farm in Connecticut, his first extended time outside the segregated South. The experience shocked him. White and black workers ate together, lived together, worked side by side without the rigid barriers he had always known. He could enter any restaurant, sit anywhere on a bus, walk into any building without checking for signs that said "whites only" or "colored entrance in rear." The freedom was intoxicating and heartbreaking at the same time. It showed him that segregation was not inevitable or natural, that it was a choice Southern society had made and enforced through law and violence. When he returned to Atlanta, the segregation he had always known felt more suffocating than ever. He had tasted something different, and he could not forget the flavor. His hatred of segregation deepened, but so did his conviction that it could be defeated. If Connecticut could function without these barriers, then Georgia could too. The question was how to dismantle a system that had existed for centuries, that was protected by law and defended by people willing to use violence to maintain it. In 1948, Martin graduated from Morehouse with a degree in sociology and a decision that had been forming throughout his college years. He would become a minister, but not the kind of minister who offered only spiritual comfort. He would be a minister who challenged injustice, who spoke truth to power, who used the authority of the pulpit to demand change in the world. In February of that year, at age 19, he was ordained at Ebenezer Baptist Church, standing before a congregation that had known him since birth, taking on a mantle that had been prepared for him, but which he would wear in ways no one could predict. From Auburn Avenue, from a childhood marked by both love and humiliation, from a family that taught him to stand tall in a society that wanted to break him, Martin Luther King Jr. emerged with a vision beginning to take shape. He did not yet know that he would lead a movement, that his voice would ring from the Lincoln Memorial, that his name would be spoken with reverence by future generations. But he knew he could not accept the world as it was, and that refusal to accept injustice would set him on a path that would change America forever. Chapter 2. The Education of a Prophet. Paved. The journey from Atlanta to Pennsylvania in the fall of 1948 was more than a change of geography for Martin Luther King Jr. It was a passage into a world where his intellect would be sharpened, his philosophy formed, and his understanding of how to fight injustice would be transformed. At 19 years old, he enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, one of only a handful of black students in a predominantly white institution. The experience would test him, shape him, and ultimately arm him with the intellectual and spiritual tools he would need for the battles ahead. Klangzer was different from anything he had known. Here, he was not just tolerated but welcomed, judged not by the color of his skin, but by the quality of his mind. The transformation was both liberating and disorienting. For the first time in his life, he sat in classrooms where he was one of the few black faces, yet no one questioned his right to be there. His professors challenged his ideas, pushed him to defend his positions, treated him as an intellectual equal. The validation was powerful, but it also carried a burden. He felt the weight of representation, the unspoken pressure to excel not just for himself, but to prove that black students belonged in these halls. Martin threw himself into his studies with fierce determination. He read voraciously, devouring theology, philosophy, history, and social theory. He explored the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, whose Christian realism challenged him to think about the nature of evil and the limitations of human virtue. He studied Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel movement, which argued that Christianity must concern itself with social justice, not just personal salvation. These ideas resonated deeply with the young seminarian, who had grown up watching his father fight against segregation while preaching about salvation. But it was the philosophy of a man halfway around the world that would provide Martin with the framework he had been seeking. In a lecture on Mahatma Gandhi, he encountered for the first time a comprehensive strategy for confronting injustice through non-violent resistance. Gandhi had led India to independence from British colonial rule without armies or weapons, using only the moral force of truth and the collective power of people willing to suffer for justice. The concept struck Martin like lightning. He had grown up in a church that preached loving your enemies, but he had struggled to reconcile that teaching with the reality of fighting segregation. How could you love Bull Connor while he set dogs on children? How could you love the Klansmen who bombed churches? Gandhi provided an answer. Nonviolence was not passive acceptance of evil. It was active resistance that refused to dehumanize the oppressor, even while dismantling the system of oppression. It was a sword that cut without wounding, a power that conquered without destroying. Martin devoured everything he could find about Gandhi's campaigns. He studied the Salt March, where thousands walked to the sea to make their own salt in defiance of British law. He read about the boycotts, the fasts, the willingness to fill jails until the system could no longer function. He saw how non-violent resistance required more courage than violence, because it demanded that you absorb suffering rather than inflict it. It meant standing firm while batons fell, remaining peaceful while dogs bit, accepting jail while maintaining dignity. The philosophy resonated with his Christian faith, but gave it a practical edge. Jesus had taught about turning the other cheek, about loving enemies, about the power of suffering love. Gandhi had shown how to translate those spiritual principles into political action. The combination was electric. Martin began to envision how these ideas could be applied to the struggle against segregation in America. He did not yet know that he would be the one to lead such a campaign, but the seeds were planted and they were already taking root in fertile soil. At Crozer, Martin's gifts as a speaker and leader became increasingly evident. His classmates, almost all of them white, elected him president of the student body in his senior year. It was a remarkable vote of confidence, a sign that his intellect and character had earned respect that transcended racial barriers. He graduated at the top of his class in 1951, winning both academic honors and a fellowship for further study. The world was opening before him, offering possibilities that would have been unthinkable for most black men of his generation. He chose to pursue a doctorate at Boston University, diving deeper into systematic theology and the philosophy of religion. Boston, in the early 1950s, was a city of intellectual ferment, where ideas clashed and merged in the cafes and classrooms around the great universities. Martin thrived in this environment, engaging in debates that stretched late into the night, refining his thoughts on God, justice, and the nature of moral action. He also took classes at Harvard, expanding his intellectual horizons even further. But Boston gave him something more precious than academic credentials. At a gathering of students and young professionals, he met Coretta Scott, a talented singer studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was from Alabama, from a rural background not unlike his father's origins, but she had cultivated her voice and her mind with fierce determination. When Martin called her for a first date, he spoke with such confidence that she was both charmed and wary. He told her he wanted to meet her because he knew she had character, intelligence, and personality, three things he was looking for in a wife. The boldness was calculated, but not insincere. Martin knew what he wanted in a partner. He needed someone who understood the South, who knew the weight of segregation, but who also had the strength, vision to fight it. He needed someone who could stand with him in the struggles he sensed were coming. Coretta was not sure about this young preacher at first, but his intelligence, his passion for justice, and the depth of his conviction won her over. They talked for hours, discovering in each other kindred spirits who refused to accept the world's limitations. Martin's father had reservations about the match. He had hoped his son would marry someone from Atlanta's black elite, someone who would enhance the family's standing in the community. Coretta was talented and educated, but she came from a family of modest means, and King Sr. worried about appearances. Martin, however, had inherited his father's stubbornness. He told his father plainly that he would marry Coretta with or without approval. Faced with his son's determination, King Sr. relented, and on June 18, 1953, he performed the marriage ceremony at the Scott family home in Perry County, Alabama. The marriage was a partnership of equals, though the times would often push them into traditional roles. Coretta was a trained musician with dreams of a concert career, but she would set those dreams aside to support her husband's calling and to raise their children. Yet she was never simply a preacher's wife. She became an advisor, a strategist, a source of strength during the darkest moments. When Martin doubted himself, when the death threats piled up, when the FBI surveillance drove him to despair, Coretta was the rock on which he steadied himself. As Martin worked on his dissertation, the question of where to begin his career loomed large. He received offers from universities and prestigious churches in the North, positions that would have given him comfort and security. But something pulled him back to the South. He knew that the battle against segregation would be fought there, on the ground where the system was most entrenched and most brutal. Running to the North would be choosing safety over purpose, and he had not endured years of education and preparation to choose the easy path. In 1954, he received an offer from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. The church was middle-class, educated, influential in the black community. It was also in the heart of the Deep South, in a city where segregation was enforced with meticulous cruelty. Martin visited, preached a trial sermon, and felt the call despite the danger. This was where he needed to be. In September 1954, with his doctorate nearly complete, he moved with Coretta to Montgomery and took the pulpit at Dexter Avenue. The young minister, just 25 years old, arrived in Montgomery with his mind full of philosophy and theology, with Gandhi's principles of non-violent resistance as his guide, with a wife who believed in his vision, and with a calling he could not ignore. He did not know that in just over a year, history would thrust him into a role he had not sought, but for which all his education and experience had prepared him. He did not know that an act of defiance by a tired seamstress would light a fuse that would explode across the South and eventually across the nation. But as he stood in his new pulpit, looking out at the expectant faces of his congregation, he felt the weight of preparation meeting opportunity. The education of a prophet was complete. What remained was to see if the ideas he had studied in books could stand against billy clubs and firebombs. What remained was to see if non-violent resistance could actually work in a place like Montgomery, Alabama, where violence was the language power spoke most fluently. What remained was to see if a young preacher with a gift for words and an unshakable faith in justice could lead a people out of oppression without becoming what he fought against. The answer would come soon enough, and it would shake the foundations of the South. Chapter 3. 381 Days That Shook the South. Face. December 1st, 1955, began as an ordinary day in Montgomery, Alabama. The winter air carried a slight chill as black workers moved through the city on their way to jobs cooking food for white families, cleaning white homes, tending white children. They rode the buses because walking the distances was often impossible, because cars were luxuries most could not afford. But riding the bus as a black person in Montgomery was an act of daily humiliation, a constant reminder that in the eyes of the law and custom, they were less than fully human. Rosa Parks knew this humiliation intimately. A seamstress at a downtown department store, she was also the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, a woman of quiet strength and deep conviction. At 42, she had spent decades navigating the indignities of segregation with grace, but without acceptance. She had attended workshops on civil rights, had studied the philosophy of non-violent resistance, had waited for the right moment to make a stand. That evening, after a long day's work, Rosa boarded a city bus and took a seat in the middle section, the area where black passengers could sit until white passengers needed those seats. The bus filled as it moved through downtown. More white passengers boarded. The driver, James Blake, ordered the black passengers in Rosa's row to give up their seats and move to the back. The other black passengers complied as they always had, as the law and survival demanded. But Rosa Parks stayed seated. Blake asked her again, his voice harder this time, carrying the threat that every black person in Montgomery understood. Stand up or face arrest. But something in Rosa Parks had reached its limit. She had been thrown off a bus by this same driver years earlier for refusing to enter through the back door after paying at the front. She had watched too many people she loved forced to bow and scrape before people who considered them inferior. She had heard too many sermons about dignity and worth while living in a system designed to deny both. So she looked at the driver and said the word that would launch a movement. No. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of centuries. No, I will not move. No, I will not accept this humiliation. No, I will not cooperate with a system that treats me as less than human. Blake stopped the bus and called the police. Rosa Parks was arrested, fingerprinted, and jailed for violating Montgomery's segregation ordinance. The news spread through black Montgomery like electricity through water, fast and charged with potential. That night, a group of activists gathered to discuss how to respond. Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council stayed up printing flyers, calling for a one-day bus boycott on December 5th, the day of Rosa Parks's trial. E.D. Nixon, president of the local NAACP, began calling black ministers and community leaders, urging them to support the boycott. The idea was not new. There had been boycotts before in other cities. But in Montgomery, in this moment, with this catalyst, something different was about to emerge. The ministers agreed to support the boycott and to form an organization to coordinate it. They called it the Montgomery Improvement Association. But who would lead it? The question hung in the air of that meeting room like smoke. It needed to be someone with credibility, with speaking ability, with courage. It needed to be someone who had not yet made too many enemies, someone fresh enough to bring people together. Several names were proposed and rejected. Then someone mentioned the young preacher at Dexter Avenue, Martin Luther King, Jr. King was hesitant when they approached him. He had been in Montgomery barely a year. He was finishing his doctoral dissertation. Coretta had just given birth to their first child, Yolanda. He was building his ministry, establishing his reputation. Taking on this role would make him a target, would disrupt his plans, would expose his family to danger. But the men in that room pressed him. They needed him. The moment demanded someone, and that someone was him. He agreed, and in that agreement, his life changed forever. On December 5th, 1955, the buses of Montgomery rolled through the city nearly empty of black passengers. The boycott was 90% effective, a stunning show of unity and resolve. Black people walked to work, some traveling miles in the cold. They organized carpools with the few who owned cars. They waited at makeshift pickup stations. They supported each other with a determination that surprised even themselves. That evening, the Montgomery Improvement Association held its first mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. Thousands came, so many that the church could not hold them all. They spilled into the streets, listening to the proceedings through loudspeakers. King arrived to find a scene of controlled chaos, of energy and expectation. He had been given only 20 minutes to prepare his speech, but what he delivered that night was a masterpiece of moral clarity and strategic vision. Unless his voice rang out over the crowd as he spoke of Rosa Parks and her courage, of the indignities black people had endured for too long, of their constitutional right to protest. He told them they were tired of being trampled by the iron feet of oppression. He told them they had no alternative but to protest. But then he said something that would define the movement he was about to lead. He said they must conduct their protest with dignity and discipline, with Christian love and non-violent resistance. He said they must not allow anyone to pull them so low as to hate them. He said that when the history books were written, people would have to say there lived a race of people who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. The church erupted. People wept and shouted and sang. They voted unanimously to continue the boycott until the city agreed to more humane treatment on the buses. They did not yet know it would last 381 days. They did not know the cost they would pay, but in that moment they felt the power of their unity, and it was intoxicating. The city fought back with everything it had. King and other leaders were arrested for violating a law against conspiracies to interfere with business. The police harassed black taxi drivers who were helping boycotters. Insurance companies cancelled policies on the cars used in the carpool. But the boycott continued. The Montgomery Improvement Association organized a sophisticated carpool system with dispatch centers and coordinated pickup locations. Church services became mass meetings where people shared news, sang spirituals, and drew strength from collective resistance. The white power structure tried everything to break the movement. They tried intimidation and arrests. They tried economic pressure, firing black workers who supported the boycott. They tried legal maneuvers and injunctions. When those tactics failed, they resorted to violence. On January 30th, 1956, while King was at a mass meeting, someone threw a bomb onto his front porch. The explosion shattered windows and filled the house with smoke. Coretta and baby Yolanda were inside, but escaped injury. King rushed home to find an angry crowd of black citizens gathered outside, some armed, ready to fight back against the attack. This was the moment when everything could have collapsed into violence. The crowd was furious, frightened, ready to defend their leader by any means necessary. Police stood nearby, nervous, hands on weapons. The mayor and police chief had come to assess the damage, and they stood vulnerable before a crowd that had every reason to hate them. King stepped onto his bombed porch and raised his hands. His voice cut through the tension. He told the crowd to go home peacefully. He told them that living by violence meant dying by violence. He told them that he and his family were safe and that the cause was bigger than any individual. He told them to remember that if something happened to him, there would be others to continue the work. He asked them to love their enemies and pray for those who persecuted them. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. The police and city officials left unharmed. That moment revealed the true power of non-violent resistance. King had not just prevented a riot, he had shown that it was possible to absorb violence without returning it, to maintain discipline even in the face of terror. The bombing had been meant to intimidate him into quitting. Instead, it strengthened his resolve and proved to the nation that he could control the movement even in the most volatile situations. The boycott ground on through winter and into spring, then through a sweltering summer. The Montgomery Bus Company bled money. Downtown businesses suffered as black shoppers stayed away. But the city officials refused to negotiate seriously. They were fighting to preserve not just bus segregation, but the entire system of white supremacy that it represented. To compromise on buses would be to admit that the whole structure could be challenged and changed. King and the other leaders understood this too. They filed a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of bus segregation. As the case made its way through the courts, the boycott continued. Black Montgomery discovered reserves of strength they had not known they possessed. An elderly woman, asked if she was tired of walking so far each day, replied that her feet were tired, but her soul was resting. That phrase captured the spirit of the movement. They were tired, yes, but they were free in a way they had never been before. They had stopped cooperating with their own oppression. On November 13, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. The victory was complete and undeniable. After 381 days of walking, carpooling, and enduring harassment, the black community of Montgomery had won. On December 20th, Martin Luther King Jr. and other black leaders boarded a Montgomery bus and sat wherever they chose. The cameras captured the moment for history. King sat near the front, his face serious but satisfied, knowing that this victory was not just about seats on buses, but about dignity, about self-respect, about proving that organized, non-violent resistance could work. But the victory came with a cost that would shadow King for the rest of his life. The day after integrated buses began running, snipers fired on buses in the early morning hours. In January 1957, the homes and churches of leaders, including Ralph Abernathy's home and church, were bombed. The Ku Klux Klan was not ready to accept defeat, and they expressed their rage with dynamite and bullets. Yet the movement had crossed a threshold. The Montgomery bus boycott proved that black Americans could organize effectively, could sustain a long struggle, and could win. It created a model that would be used again and again in the years to come. It established Martin Luther King Jr. as the most prominent leader in the emerging civil rights movement. At 27 years old, he had led a campaign that shook the South and captured the attention of the nation and the world. The young prophet who had studied Gandhi in seminary had now put those theories into practice. He had discovered that non-violent resistance was not just a philosophical ideal, but a practical strategy that could dismantle systems of oppression. He had learned that leadership meant staying calm when bombs exploded, maintaining discipline when hatred raged, holding to principles when compromise seemed easier. He had learned that change was possible but costly, that victories were real but never final. From Montgomery, King emerged as a national figure, but he also emerged with a target on his back, with enemies who would spend the rest of his life trying to destroy him, and with a calling that would demand everything he had to give. The 381 days that shook the South were only the beginning. The real battles, the ones that would define America's soul, still lay ahead. Chapter 4. Birmingham. The turning point. Blank reputation even among southern cities known for their cruelty toward black people. Birmingham, Alabama, earned its nickname not through exaggeration, but through documented brutality. They called it Bombingham because of the frequency with which black homes and churches exploded. Between 1957 and 1963, 17 unsolved bombings targeted the black community. The Ku Klux Klan operated openly, with ties to the police force. Segregation was not just law in Birmingham, it was religion, enforced with the fervor of true believers willing to use violence to defend their faith. Martin Luther King Jr. knew all of this when he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to launch a campaign there in the spring of 1963. Other activists warned him that Birmingham was too dangerous, too entrenched in its ways, too violent. But King understood something crucial about the civil rights movement at that moment in history. Progress had stalled. The momentum from Montgomery had dissipated. A campaign in Albany, Georgia, the previous year had failed to achieve meaningful change. The movement needed a victory, and it needed to demonstrate to the nation that segregation could not stand, even in its strongest fortress. Fred Shuttlesworth, The brave minister who led Birmingham's Alabama Christian movement for human rights, had invited King to join forces. Shuttlesworth was a man of almost reckless courage, repeatedly beaten, his home bombed, yet refusing to leave or be silent. He knew Birmingham's power structure intimately, knew its weaknesses as well as its strengths. Together with King and other SCLC leaders, they developed Project C, with the C standing for confrontation. They would confront segregation in Birmingham's downtown stores during the Easter shopping season, when economic pressure would be most effective. But there was another reason Birmingham was the perfect target. Its Commissioner of Public Safety was Eugene Bull Connor, a racist whose contempt for black people was matched only by his arrogance and hot temper. Connor believed in responding to protests with overwhelming force. King and his strategists knew that Connor's violent response to non-violent protesters would create the kind of national outrage that could force federal intervention. They were, in a sense, counting on Connor to be exactly who he was. The campaign began on April 3, 1963, with small sit-ins at downtown lunch counters. The response was swift arrests, but Connor exercised restraint at first, quietly filling the jails without giving the protesters what they wanted: televised brutality that would shock the nation. The demonstrations grew, but media coverage remained minimal. The campaign was in danger of fizzling out, just as Albany had. The jails were filling, but money for bail bonds was running out, and the community seemed apathetic rather than energized. Prisons. On April 10th, the city obtained a court injunction forbidding further protests. King faced an agonizing decision. Breaking a court injunction, even one he believed was unconstitutional, would turn many potential allies against him. It would make fundraising harder, but obeying the injunction would end the campaign and show that the white power structure could use the courts to stop civil rights protests. After a night of prayer and consultation, King decided to march despite the injunction. On Good Friday, April 12, King and Ralph Abernathy led 50 people toward downtown Birmingham. The police arrested them almost immediately. King was placed in solitary confinement, denied the right to call his attorney, kept in darkness. Coretta, at home in Atlanta with their children, heard nothing from him for 2 days. She contacted the Kennedy administration in desperation. The intervention of the White House got King access to a phone, but he remained in jail, and it was there, in that Birmingham cell, that he did some of his most important writing. Disjointerman had published a statement calling King's demonstrations unwise and untimely, urging black people to seek justice through the courts rather than through direct action. King, with no writing paper available, began composing a response in the margins of the newspaper containing their statement, on toilet paper, on scraps of paper smuggled to him by a friendly guard. His response, which would become known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, was both a defense of civil disobedience and a theological argument for why waiting was no longer acceptable. He wrote of waiting while black people were lynched and drowned. He wrote of trying to explain to his 6-year-old daughter why she could not go to the amusement park advertised on television, seeing tears well up in her eyes when he told her that Funtown was closed to colored children, watching the light of innocence fade from her face as she began to understand the system of segregation. He wrote that justice too long delayed is justice denied. He wrote that one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. He wrote that the white moderate who prefers order to justice was a greater obstacle than the Klan member who is openly hostile. The letter, when it was finally published, became one of the most powerful articulations of civil rights philosophy ever written. But while King wrote in jail, the campaign outside was faltering. Money for bail bonds was exhausted, protesters were growing weary. The white business community remained unmoved. Bull Connor's restraint was working. By arresting protesters quietly, he was avoiding the spectacle that would attract national attention. Forbidden. Then James Bevel, one of the SCLC's most creative strategists, proposed an idea that was both brilliant and controversial. He suggested recruiting high school students, even children, to march. The reasoning was both practical and strategic. Black adults who protested often lost their jobs, putting their families at risk. Students had less to lose and more energy for sustained action. Moreover, Bevel argued, the sight of children being arrested would force the nation to confront the moral dimension of segregation in a way that adult protesters had not. King was initially reluctant. Using children seemed to invite disaster. But as he listened to Bevel's arguments, and as the campaign continued to stall, he gave his approval. On May 2, 1963, more than 1,000 black students, some as young as 8 years old, left 16th Street Baptist Church and marched toward downtown Birmingham. They sang freedom songs as they walked. Bull Connor arrested hundreds of them, filling the jails and overflow facilities. The next day, May 3rd, more children came. This time, Connor's restraint shattered. Enraged by the continuing protests, frustrated that arrests were not deterring the marchers, he ordered his men to use fire hoses and police dogs on the young protesters. The fire hoses were not ordinary water streams. They were high-pressure hoses capable of tearing bark off trees and rolling a grown man down the street. When turned on children, they knocked them off their feet, slammed them against walls, tore their clothes from their bodies. The dogs were German shepherds, trained to attack on command. Television cameras captured them lunging at teenage protesters, teeth bared, as their handlers held the leashes. One photograph, which would run on the front pages of newspapers around the world, showed a police dog attacking a black teenager whose crime was wanting to be treated as a human being. Another image captured children being blasted by fire hoses, their bodies tumbling helplessly from the force of the water. The images exploded across the nation and around the world. Suddenly, Birmingham was not just a local conflict, but an international scandal. People who had been indifferent to the civil rights movement could not ignore the sight of children being attacked for wanting basic human rights. President Kennedy, watching the footage on television, said the images made him sick. Public opinion, which had been divided or apathetic, began to shift decisively toward the protesters. Connor had given King exactly what the strategy required: undeniable evidence of the brutality that maintained segregation. But the cost was measured in the trauma inflicted on children who would carry the memory of those dogs and fire hoses for the rest of their lives. King both celebrated the courage of the young people and agonized over the burden they had been asked to bear. He told parents that their children were doing work not just for themselves, but for all of America and all of humanity. The business community of Birmingham, facing economic pressure from the boycott and national condemnation from the images of brutality, finally agreed to negotiate. They promised to desegregate downtown stores, create employment opportunities for black workers, and form a biracial committee to work on further integration. On May 10, King announced a settlement. The campaign had achieved its goals. But Birmingham was not finished with violence. Hours after the agreement was announced, bombs exploded at the Gaston Motel, where King had been staying, and at the home of King's brother. Riots erupted as black residents, pushed beyond endurance, fought back against police. For a moment, the carefully maintained discipline of non-violence seemed to be crumbling. King rushed back to Birmingham and toured the affected areas, urging calm, calling people back to the principles that had brought them this far. The violence shocked the Kennedy administration into action. President Kennedy went on national television to deliver a speech declaring civil rights a moral issue. He said that America would not be truly free until all its citizens were free, that the time had come to deliver on the promises of the Constitution. He proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation that would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Without Birmingham, without the images of children being attacked, that legislation might never have been introduced. But Birmingham had one more horror to deliver. On September 15, 1963, 4 months after the campaign ended, members of the Ku Klux Klan planted dynamite under the steps of 16th Street Baptist Church, the staging ground for the demonstrations. The bomb exploded during Sunday school, killing 4 little girls: Denise McNair, age 11, and Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins, all 14 years old. They died because they were black, because their church had become associated with the fight for civil rights, because evil could not stand the thought of black children growing up believing they deserved equality. King delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he tried to make sense of senseless violence. He told the grieving families that their children died as martyrs, that they did not die in vain, that their deaths would serve as redemptive forces that would transform the nation. He held Coretta's hand at the funeral and thought of his own children, wondered if they too might one day be targets of such hatred. Birmingham had been a turning point, but the turn had been bought with trauma and blood. The campaign proved that non-violent resistance could work even against the most vicious opposition. It moved the needle of public opinion decisively towards civil rights. It forced the federal government to act, but it also demonstrated the depths of hatred that existed in the South, the willingness of people to murder children rather than accept equality. King left Birmingham knowing that the movement had crossed a crucial threshold. National legislation was now on the horizon. The moral clarity of the civil rights cause could no longer be denied. But he also left Birmingham knowing that every victory would be paid for in suffering, that the road ahead would be marked by more violence, more death, more heartbreak. The enemy was wounded but not defeated, dangerous in its desperation. And the cost of victory, as 4 small coffins being lowered into the ground testified, would be almost too high to bear. Chapter 5. A Dream on the National Mall. Norwich. The idea had been building for years, gathering momentum like a river fed by countless streams. Philip Randolph, the great labor leader who had threatened a march on Washington in 1941 to demand defense jobs for black workers, revived the concept in the early 1960s. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, James Farmer of CORE, John Lewis of SNCC, Whitney Young of the Urban League, and Martin Luther King Jr. of the SCLC, the leaders who would become known as the Big Six, came together to plan what would be the largest demonstration for civil rights in American history. Condemned it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a name that captured both the civil rights and economic justice dimensions of the struggle. The date was set for August 28, 1963, just weeks after the Birmingham campaign ended. The goals were clear: passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, integration of schools, protection of civil rights workers from police brutality, a massive jobs program, and a national minimum wage law. It would be peaceful, dignified, and so large that Congress and the President could not ignore it. Not everyone thought the march was a good idea. President Kennedy worried that if it turned violent or if turnout was disappointing, it would hurt rather than help the civil rights cause. Some activists thought marches had become ineffective, that more radical action was needed. But the organizers pushed forward. Bayard Rustin, a brilliant strategist and organizer who had worked with King since Montgomery, was put in charge of logistics. He had just 2 months to coordinate transportation, housing, security, and programming for what they hoped would be over 100,000 people. Submerged So 28th dawned bright and clear over Washington, D.C. Buses began arriving in the pre-dawn hours, disgorging passengers who had traveled through the night from cities and towns across America. They came from New York and Chicago, from Mississippi and Alabama, from California and Michigan. They came in church groups and union delegations, as families and as individuals. Some were veterans of years of civil rights work. Others had never attended a protest before but could not stay home on this day. By mid-morning, the crowd gathering at the Washington Monument was already larger than organizers had dared hope. The participants were overwhelmingly black, but included significant numbers of white supporters, people who had decided that this was their fight too. Folk singers performed on makeshift stages. Civil rights anthems drifted across the mall. People stood in the August heat, patient and expectant, aware that they were part of something historic. The formal program began with speeches from religious leaders, labor organizers, and civil rights activists. Each speaker brought a different perspective on the struggle. A. Philip Randolph, the elder statesman of the movement, provided historical context. John Lewis, the young chairman of SNCC, who had been beaten bloody multiple times for attempting to register voters, delivered a fiery speech that had been toned down from his original draft, but still crackled with righteous anger. Forgiveness Sam, Alelia Jackson, the greatest gospel singer of her generation, sang a spiritual that moved many in the crowd to tears. Her voice carried across the mall, rich and powerful, a sound that seemed to come from a deeper place than the human voice should reach. She had sung at many of King's rallies, and he always said that her singing did as much to move hearts as his preaching. King was scheduled to speak last among the main speakers. As the afternoon wore on and speaker followed speaker, the crowd grew restless in the heat. Some began to leave, fearing that the event was running too long. But when King's turn came, those who remained and those watching on television would witness one of the defining moments in American history. He stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the massive statue of the great emancipator looming behind him, and began his prepared remarks. His voice rolled out across the crowd, amplified by loudspeakers but carrying its own power. He spoke of the promissory note America had written in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, a promise that all men would be guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said America had defaulted on that promissory note where black citizens were concerned, had given them a bad check marked insufficient funds. Defiance. The crowd responded with growing energy as King built his speech, each point landing with the precision of a master craftsman. But even as he spoke, those close to the podium could sense that he was not fully engaged, that he was delivering prepared remarks without the spontaneous fire that characterized his best sermons. The speech was good, but it was not great. It was not yet the moment that would echo through history. Then, Mahalia Jackson, sitting behind King on the platform, called out to him. Her voice cut through the formal atmosphere, speaking to him the way she would in church, reminding him of something he had preached about before in rallies and sermons. She shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" King heard her. Something shifted. He pushed aside his prepared text and reached for words that came from a deeper well. "I still have a dream," he began, his voice changing, becoming more immediate, more personal. The crowd responded, sensing the shift, leaning in. He was no longer delivering a speech, he was testifying, preaching, pouring out a vision that had sustained him through beatings and bombings and endless nights of fear. He said he had a dream, that one day this nation would rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. He painted pictures with words. Sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood. The state of Mississippi transformed from a desert of oppression into an oasis of freedom and justice. Each vision built on the last, climbing higher, pulling the crowd with him. He said he had a dream that his 4 little children would one day live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That line, perhaps more than any other, captured what the movement was fighting for. Not special treatment, but equal treatment. Not preferences, but fairness. Not vengeance, but justice. The crowd was caught up now, responding to each declaration with shouts and applause. King's voice rose and fell, using all the techniques of the black preaching tradition, borrowing cadences from the Bible and the great Negro spirituals. He said he had a dream that one day every valley would be exalted and every hill and mountain made low, quoting from Isaiah, connecting the civil rights movement to the ancient prophetic tradition. Then he moved toward his conclusion, calling on the promise of the old Negro spiritual that said, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." His voice rang out across the mall, and the crowd was on its feet, many weeping, many raising their hands as if in church. Television cameras captured it all, broadcasting the moment to millions watching across America and around the world. Injecting Selps lasted 17 minutes, but it felt like both an instant and an eternity. When King finished and stepped back from the podium, the crowd exploded in sustained applause. People who had been there said you could feel the ground shake from the collective energy. Something had happened that transcended politics or policy. For a few minutes, standing in the presence of that dream, the impossible had seemed possible. A nation divided by centuries of racial hatred had glimpsed a different future, and the vision was so beautiful that even those who opposed it could not entirely dismiss it. In the immediate aftermath, commentators and reporters scrambled to capture what they had witnessed. James Reston of the New York Times wrote that King had touched all the themes of the day better than anyone else, that he was full of the symbolism of Lincoln and Gandhi and the cadences of the Bible, that he was both militant and sad. Others called it the greatest speech of the 20th century, a landmark in American rhetoric. But the true measure of the speech would be its lasting impact. The phrases King improvised that day, the images of the dream, would become permanently embedded in American consciousness. Children would memorize passages in schools. The speech would be played at countless commemorations, quoted by presidents and activists, translated into dozens of languages. It would become the lens through which many Americans, particularly white Americans, understood the civil rights movement, sometimes simplifying King's more radical message, but also keeping alive the moral challenge he posed. Blackjack. After the speeches ended, King and other leaders met with President Kennedy at the White House. The march had been a stunning success, with 250,000 people participating peacefully. Kennedy praised the organizers and promised to push for civil rights legislation. But he also cautioned that passing such legislation through Congress would be difficult, that the political obstacles remained formidable. King left Washington that day exhausted but elated. The march had demonstrated the power of the movement, had shown that Black Americans and their allies could organize a massive, peaceful demonstration that forced the nation to pay attention. It had given the movement momentum at a crucial time. It had produced a speech that would live far beyond the moment of its delivery. But even in his exhaustion, King knew that speeches did not change laws, and laws did not automatically change hearts. The real work, the grinding daily work of organizing and protesting and negotiating, would continue. The opposition would not give up simply because 250,000 people had gathered on the National Mall. Violence would continue. People would still die. The road ahead remained long and dangerous. Yet the dream he had articulated was now part of the national conversation in a way it had never been before. It gave people language to express their hopes, a vision to measure their society against, a goal to work toward. And that dream, imperfectly realized, constantly challenged, would prove more durable than the hatred arrayed against it. That dream, born in suffering and articulated in the shadow of Lincoln's memorial, would outlive its prophet and continue to call America toward the better angels of its nature. Chapter 6. Bloody Sunday and the Road to Voting Rights. Right to vote should have been simple. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1870, explicitly stated that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race. But in Selma, Alabama, and across much of the South, that constitutional guarantee was a fiction maintained by violence and bureaucratic manipulation. Despite making up more than half of Dallas County's population, only 2% of Black citizens were registered to vote. The courthouse, where registration took place, was a fortress designed to keep Black citizens from exercising their rights. The tactics were many and creative. Registrars were available only on certain days and certain hours, making it difficult for workers to find time to register. When Black citizens did manage to get to the courthouse, they faced literacy tests designed to be impossible to pass. They were asked to interpret obscure passages of the Alabama Constitution, to answer questions about constitutional law that would have challenged lawyers. White applicants faced no such tests, or if they did, The tests were a formality that everyone passed. Sheriff Jim Clark enforced this system with enthusiastic brutality. He and his deputies used cattle prods, billy clubs, and sheer intimidation to discourage black citizens from even attempting to register. Civil rights workers who came to help with voter registration were arrested on spurious charges. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had been working in Selma for over a year with minimal progress. They invited King and the SCLC to bring national attention to the voting rights struggle. King came to Selma in January 1965, knowing this would be another major confrontation. He and local leaders organized marches to the courthouse, where black citizens would attempt to register. Day after day, they lined up, and day after day, Sheriff Clark and his men met them with hostility. The arrests mounted, the jails filled, but the protests continued, and slowly, the media began to pay attention to the story unfolding in this small Alabama city. Synchronized, on February 18th, violence exploded in nearby Marion during a nighttime march. State troopers attacked the marchers without warning, beating them with clubs and spraying them with tear gas. In the chaos, 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson tried to protect his mother from a trooper who was beating her. Another trooper shot Jackson in the stomach. He died 8 days later, becoming another martyr in the long list of those killed for asserting their rights. Camouflage, the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, galvanized the civil rights community in Selma. James Bevel proposed a dramatic response, a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to confront Governor George Wallace directly. It would be 54 miles, a multi-day march through some of the most hostile territory in Alabama. King and other leaders agreed to the plan, though they knew that risks were enormous. The march was scheduled for March 7, 1965. King was in Atlanta that Sunday, preaching at his father's church, planning to join the marchers along the route the next day. But around 600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma that morning, ready to begin. They knew the odds were against them, knew that Governor Wallace had ordered state troopers to stop them by any means necessary. But they also knew that someone had to take a stand. John Lewis of SNCC and Hosea Williams of SCLC led the marchers out of the church. They walked through the streets of Selma toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which spanned the Alabama River on the road to Montgomery. The march was silent, except for the sound of feet on pavement. The marchers were nervous but determined, many having written goodbye letters to their families in case they did not return. As they crested the bridge, they saw what awaited them on the other side. Over 100 Alabama state troopers stood in formation across the highway, some on horseback, all wearing gas masks. Sheriff Clark and his deputies were there too, many mounted and carrying clubs and bullwhips. The marchers kept walking, descending the bridge toward the line of troopers. Major John Cloud, commander of the state troopers, ordered the marchers to disperse. He gave them 2 minutes to turn back. John Lewis asked if they could pray. Cloud ignored the request. After just over 1 minute, he ordered his men to advance. What happened next was captured by television cameras and broadcast into living rooms across America. The troopers moved forward in formation, clubs raised. They crashed into the front lines of marchers like a wave hitting a shore. John Lewis, in the front line, was struck on the head with such force that his skull fractured. He fell to the ground, sure he was going to die. Around him, men and women were being beaten, trampled by horses, choked by tear gas. The troopers showed no restraint, swinging their clubs at anyone within reach, including women and elderly people. The marchers tried to retreat back towards Selma, but mounted troopers chased them, continuing the assault. Horses ran down fleeing protesters. The crack of billy clubs on skulls echoed across the bridge. Screams mixed with the shouted orders of the troopers. In less than 10 minutes, the march was over. 17 marchers were hospitalized. Dozens more were injured, but not severely enough for admission. Amelia Boynton, a local civil rights leader, was beaten unconscious. Photographs of her lying motionless on the bridge would run in newspapers around the world. Television networks interrupted their regular programming to show footage of the attack. Americans sitting down to Sunday dinner or watching afternoon programs suddenly witnessed their government agents beating unarmed citizens. The images were undeniable and horrifying. Even people who had been indifferent to civil rights could not ignore what they said. This was not a dispute about policy or a difference of opinion. This was brutal violence against people who were simply trying to exercise their constitutional rights. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it ignited a firestorm of outrage. Protests erupted in cities across the country. Religious leaders, white and black, began traveling to Selma to show solidarity. President Johnson came under enormous pressure to act. King, watching the news in Atlanta, felt both anguish for those who had been beaten and determination to turn this tragedy into a catalyst for change. 2 days later, on March 9th, King led another march to the bridge. This time, even more people participated, including hundreds of white clergy from around the nation. But King faced a dilemma. A federal judge had issued an order prohibiting the march until he could hold hearings. King did not want to violate a federal court order, but he also did not want to appear to back down in the face of violence. When the marchers reached the bridge and found state troopers again blocking the way, King led them in prayer, then turned the march around. Some activists were furious, feeling that King had betrayed the movement by not pushing forward. They called it Turnaround Tuesday and accused him of compromising. But King had made a calculated decision. He needed federal court approval for the full march to Montgomery, and he needed President Johnson's support. Confronting the troopers again, without preparation, risked more violence and potential loss of the moral high ground. That night, 3 white Unitarian ministers who had come to Selma for the march were attacked by Klansmen outside a restaurant. Reverend James Reeb was beaten so severely that he died 2 days later. The death of a white minister brought even more attention to Selma and created additional pressure on the federal government to intervene. On March 15th, President Lyndon Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress, a nationally televised event that marked a turning point in the civil rights struggle. Speaking with passion that surprised even his supporters, Johnson declared that the events in Selma were part of a far larger movement to secure equal rights for all Americans. He said that the Constitution says all men are created equal, but that too many black Americans had been denied that equality. He used the phrase that had become the anthem of the movement, telling Congress and the nation, "We shall overcome." For the President of the United States to adopt the language of the civil rights movement was unprecedented. Johnson then introduced voting rights legislation that would eliminate the barriers to registration and place federal oversight over areas with histories of discrimination. The speech was a victory for the movement even before the final march took place. King, watching on television, wept at the words. The sacrifice of Jimmy Lee Jackson, of John Lewis, and all those beaten on Bloody Sunday, James Reeb, had not been in vain. The nation was finally ready to act. On March 21st, with federal court approval and protection from federalized National Guard troops, the march from Selma to Montgomery finally began. 3,000 people started the journey, many of them veterans of Bloody Sunday, all of them aware that they were writing history. King led the way, Coretta at his side. The march moved through Alabama's Black Belt, past fields where their ancestors had labored as slaves, through towns where hatred still festered. Along the route, white spectators hurled insults and threats. Confederate flags waved from farmhouses, but the marchers kept moving, singing freedom songs, sustained by a sense of purpose that transcended fear. At night, they camped in fields provided by sympathetic black landowners. Folk singers like Harry Belafonte and Joan Baez came to perform for them. The march became not just a protest, but a pilgrimage, a journey toward a justice that had been denied for too long. By the time they reached Montgomery on March 25th, the crowd had swelled to 25,000. They marched to the state capitol building, where King delivered a speech on the steps. He spoke of the long history of struggle, of all those who had suffered and died for this moment. He declared that segregation was dying, that even though the arc of the moral universe was long, it bent toward justice. He asked how long it would take to achieve full equality and answered each question with the refrain, "Not long," because he believed that truth, crushed to earth, would rise again. That evening, tragedy struck again. Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Michigan who had come to help transport marchers back to Selma, was murdered by Klansmen while driving on Highway 80. She left behind 5 children and a husband, another martyr to the cause of justice. Her death underscored that the victory was incomplete, that violence would continue to shadow every step forward. But the march and the national response to Bloody Sunday had achieved what years of organizing had not. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. King attended the ceremony at the Capitol, standing near the president as he used multiple pens to sign the legislation that would finally make the 15th Amendment a reality in the South. The act eliminated literacy tests, provided for federal registrars in areas with histories of discrimination, and gave the Justice Department power to challenge voting restrictions. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Within months, black voter registration in the South increased significantly. By the end of the decade, the majority of black citizens in most southern states were registered. With the vote came political power, the ability to elect sheriffs and judges and legislators who would be accountable to black constituents. The vote changed everything. Flooring on the bloodshed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the triumph of the Voting Rights Act, the Selma campaign demonstrated again that non-violent resistance could produce concrete results. But it also demonstrated that those results came at terrible cost. John Lewis, whose skull had been fractured on Bloody Sunday, would carry the scars for the rest of his life. Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb, and Viola Liuzzo would never see the fruits of their sacrifice. And Martin Luther King Jr., standing on that Montgomery Capitol steps, knew that the battles were far from over, that new struggles awaited, that the enemies of justice would never simply accept defeat. The road from Selma to Montgomery had been 54 miles of physical distance, but centuries of historical significance. It represented the journey from slavery to freedom, from disenfranchisement to political power, from despair to hope. And though the road ahead remained long and dangerous, though violence would continue to claim lives and hatred would continue to poison hearts, the marchers had proven once again that courage could triumph over fear, that ordinary people standing together could change the world. Chapter 7. The Youngest Nobel Laureate. Pilgrimage. The telephone rang in Martin Luther King Jr.'s hospital room in Atlanta on the morning of October 14, 1964. He had checked in for a much-needed rest, exhausted from the constant travel and stress of leading the civil rights movement. The voice on the other end was Coretta's, and her words seemed almost impossible to believe. The Norwegian Nobel Committee had awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize. At 35 years old, he was the youngest person ever to receive the honor, the 12th American, and only the 3rd black person in the award's history. King's first response was not joy, but humility, bordering on inadequacy. He did not feel worthy of such recognition. He saw himself as simply one voice among many in a movement driven by thousands of people whose names would never be known. The Birmingham children who faced fire hoses, the Montgomery citizens who walked for 381 days, the Selma marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, these were the true heroes. Yet the Nobel Committee had chosen to honor him as a representative of them all, recognizing his leadership of the non-violent struggle for civil rights. Not everyone celebrated the announcement. Segregationist politicians denounced the award, with Bull Connor dismissing it as scraping the bottom of the barrel. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had waged a campaign of surveillance and harassment against King for years, reportedly was furious. But around the world, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Editorial writers praised the selection. Civil rights supporters saw it as international validation of their cause. Even some who had criticized King's methods acknowledged the significance of a Black American preacher receiving one of the world's most prestigious honors. Prize was not just an honor, but a responsibility. The Nobel Peace Prize came with a monetary award of $54,000, a substantial sum. King decided without hesitation that the money would go to the civil rights movement, divided among the organizations working for justice. He would not profit personally from the sacrifice of so many. The prize money would help fund voter registration drives, legal defense for arrested protesters, and the ongoing work of dismantling segregation. On December 4, 1964, King and a delegation of family, friends, and SCLC staff members departed for Oslo, Norway. They stopped first in London, where King preached at St. Paul's Cathedral to a packed congregation. In London, as in America, people were hungry for his message of non-violence and human dignity. He spoke of the need for spiritual as well as political transformation, of how hatred only bred more hatred, of how the choice was not between violence and non-violence, but between non-violence and non-existence. Osgivness in December was a world away from the heat and humidity of the American South. Snow covered the ground. The winter sun barely rose above the horizon. But the Norwegian people welcomed King with warmth that transcended climate. On December 10, in the auditorium of the University of Oslo, the ceremony took place before an audience of diplomats, dignitaries, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness history. Gunnar Jahn, chairman of the Nobel Committee, delivered the presentation speech. He praised King for being the first person in the Western world to have shown that a struggle can be waged without violence, for making brotherly love a reality in the course of his struggle. He spoke of how King had brought this message to all nations and races, creating a model that oppressed people around the world could follow. King rose to accept the award, wearing formal attire that felt foreign after years of wearing work clothes and being thrown into southern jails. He began his acceptance speech by stating that he accepted the prize on behalf of the civil rights movement, on behalf of those who stood with him and those who had sacrificed before him. He called them a mighty army of love that had been willing to suffer and die for freedom. Then he articulated why nonviolence was not just a tactic, but a moral imperative. Violence, he said, brought only temporary victories and perpetuated the very hatred it sought to overcome. Non-violence offered the possibility of reconciliation, of building the beloved community where former oppressors and former oppressed could live together in mutual respect. He spoke of the need to transform the jangling discords of the nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. He acknowledged that the road ahead remained long and difficult. Racial justice had not been achieved. Poverty still crushed millions. War still raged in Vietnam and other parts of the world. But he expressed his conviction that unarmed truth and unconditional love would have the final word in reality. That phrase captured the essence of his philosophy, that moral force ultimately proved stronger than physical force, that justice would prevail even when temporarily defeated. The speech was classic King, combining biblical imagery with contemporary analysis, personal humility with prophetic vision, recognition of suffering with insistence on hope. Those who heard it described feeling as if they were in the presence of something larger than one man, as if King was channeling the aspirations of millions who had been silenced by oppression. After the ceremony, King and his delegation were celebrated throughout Oslo. They attended formal dinners, met with Norwegian officials, toured the city. Everywhere King went, people wanted to shake his hand, to tell him what the American civil rights movement meant to them. He realized that the struggle for racial justice in America was being watched around the world, that it represented something larger than one nation's problems. It was about human dignity, about whether societies built on injustice could be transformed without descending into violence. From Oslo, the delegation traveled to Stockholm and other European cities. King preached in churches, gave interviews to journalists, met with political and religious leaders. The trip was exhausting, but also energizing. After years of being vilified by much of white America, of being constantly threatened and attacked, it was affirming to be honored on the world stage, to be recognized as a moral leader rather than a troublemaker. But King could not forget that back home the work continued and the dangers remained. In Alabama and Mississippi, civil rights workers were still being beaten and killed. The FBI was still wiretapping his phones, spreading false rumors about his personal life, trying to undermine his influence. Segregationists were becoming more desperate as they saw their power slipping away, and desperate men were capable of terrible violence. Prolonging the Nobel Prize brought King international stature, but it also made him more of a target. His enemies now had to contend with a leader who had been recognized as one of the world's great advocates for peace and justice. This recognition gave him leverage and protection, but it also intensified the determination of those who wanted to silence him. King returned to America in late December and immediately resumed his schedule of speeches, meetings, and organizational work. But something had shifted. The Nobel Prize had given him a platform that transcended national boundaries. When he spoke now, people around the world listened. When he took a position, it carried weight that no other American civil rights leader could match. This new stature would prove both blessing and burden in the years ahead. It gave him authority to speak out on issues beyond civil rights, including the Vietnam War and economic inequality. But it also meant that every action he took, every word he spoke, would be scrutinized and criticized by those who preferred the Nobel Laureate to stay in what they considered his place. The young man who had started as a preacher in Montgomery was now an international icon, and with that status came responsibilities and dangers that would shape his final years. The prize affirmed that the methods he had championed, the philosophy he had articulated, the struggle he had led, was recognized as morally right by people around the world. But King knew that recognition did not equal victory, that honor did not translate automatically into justice. The prize was a milestone, not a destination. The real work of creating the beloved community, of making freedom and justice realities rather than dreams, remained unfinished. And that work would demand everything he had left to give. Chapter 8. Expanding the Vision. Brighter. By 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. had achieved what many considered impossible. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed segregation in public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had secured the franchise for black Southerners. Legal segregation, the system that had defined the South for nearly a century, was crumbling. But as King looked at the landscape of American injustice, he saw that the battles won in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma had only exposed deeper problems that could not be solved through legislation alone. In the summer of 1966, King took the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Chicago, launching a campaign for open housing and economic opportunity in the North. He moved his family into a slum apartment in the West Side ghetto, wanting to experience the daily reality of northern urban poverty. What he found shocked him, even though he had intellectually understood the conditions. The poverty was grinding and systemic. Buildings were decrepit, with broken heating in winter and no air conditioning in sweltering summer. Rats infested the apartments. Children played in streets littered with garbage because there were no parks. But the poverty was different from what he had encountered in the South. In the South, segregation was legal and explicit, enforced by laws everyone could identify and challenge. In the North, discrimination was de facto rather than de jure, woven into housing patterns, lending practices, employment decisions, and school district boundaries. There were no colored-only signs to remove, no segregation ordinances to overturn in court. The injustice was structural, embedded in systems that could not be dismantled with a single piece of legislation. King organized marches through white neighborhoods to demand open housing, the right for black families to buy or rent homes wherever they could afford them. The response was vicious. White mobs attacked the marchers with rocks and bottles, screaming racial slurs, their faces twisted with hatred that matched anything King had seen in Alabama. In the Chicago suburb of Cicero, the violence was so intense that King later said he had never seen such hostility, not even in Mississippi. Northern racism, he realized, was in many ways more intractable than Southern racism because it hid behind protestations of colorblindness while maintaining the same systems of exclusion and oppression. The Chicago campaign achieved modest gains through negotiations with city officials, but King left frustrated. The problems of urban poverty and de facto segregation required solutions beyond what the civil rights movement had developed. Housing discrimination, job discrimination, inadequate schools, police brutality. These issues could not be solved with marches and boycotts alone. They required massive economic investment, political will at the highest levels, and a fundamental restructuring of American society. As King grappled with these challenges, he also confronted a crisis of conscience over the Vietnam War. For years, he had avoided speaking out forcefully against the war, partly because President Johnson had been an ally on civil rights legislation, and partly because many of his advisors warned that criticizing the war would alienate supporters and the administration. But as the war escalated, and as he saw more young black men being sent to fight and die in Southeast Asia, his silence became unbearable. He saw the connection between the war and poverty. He saw billions of dollars being spent to destroy villages in Vietnam, while American cities crumbled and American children went hungry. He saw black men fighting for freedom abroad while being denied full freedom at home. He heard the government preach non-violence to civil rights protesters while raining bombs on Vietnamese civilians. The hypocrisy was staggering, and King could no longer remain silent. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, King delivered a speech at Riverside Church in New York City that would prove one of the most controversial of his career. He titled it, "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." In it, he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He detailed the history of American intervention in Vietnam, the broken promises, the support for corrupt dictatorships. He called for an end to the bombing, for negotiations, for recognition that the Vietnamese people had the right to determine their own future. The response was swift and harsh. Major newspapers that had supported the civil rights movement condemned King for stepping outside his expertise. The NAACP Board of Directors voted to reject his position on Vietnam, insisting that civil rights and peace issues should remain separate. President Johnson felt betrayed and cut off communication with King. Even some of King's closest advisors questioned the wisdom of the speech, fearing it would destroy everything they had built. But King would not back down. The Nobel Peace Prize, he said, was not just an honor, but a commission to work for peace. He could not accept an award for peace work and remain silent about the greatest violence his nation was perpetrating. Moreover, he argued, the civil rights movement and the peace movement were inseparable. Both fought against systems that valued property over people, that used violence to maintain unjust structures, that treated human beings as means rather than ends. The criticism took a toll. King lost financial support for SCLC. He lost allies. He was disinvited from speaking engagements. But he also gained credibility with young people who had been growing disillusioned with the civil rights establishment. The students protesting on college campuses, the draft resistors, the anti-war activists, they saw in King a leader willing to challenge not just segregation, but American militarism and imperialism. confessed. In the final years of his life, King increasingly focused on economic justice as the next frontier of the movement. He began planning what he called the Poor People's Campaign, an ambitious effort to bring together poor people of all races to demand economic rights. He envisioned thousands of people camping on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., staying until Congress passed legislation guaranteeing employment, decent housing, and adequate income for all Americans. The campaign was controversial even within the civil rights movement. Some leaders thought it was too ambitious, too likely to fail. Others worried that broadening the focus beyond race would dilute the movement's power. But King believed that racism and economic exploitation were intertwined, that black people would never achieve true equality without addressing the class system that kept millions of all races in poverty. He spoke increasingly about the need for radical economic restructuring. He questioned capitalism itself, wondering whether a system based on profit could ever provide justice for all. He called for a redistribution of wealth, for guaranteed income, for an end to the worship of money that he saw as a spiritual sickness at the heart of American society. These positions moved him beyond the liberal consensus into territory that alarmed establishment leaders who had supported civil rights reform but opposed fundamental economic change. The FBI, which had been monitoring King for years, intensified its efforts to destroy him. J. Edgar Hoover saw King's opposition to the war and his economic radicalism as evidence of communist influence. Agents wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, compiled dossiers on his personal life. They sent anonymous letters trying to blackmail him. They spread false rumors to undermine his reputation. The surveillance was relentless and terrifying, a constant reminder that the government considered him a threat. King fell into periods of depression during these years. The movement was fragmenting. Younger activists, frustrated by the slow pace of change, were embracing Black Power slogans and questioning non-violence. Cities were exploding in riots as urban frustration boiled over into violence. The Vietnam War was tearing the nation apart. The Poor People's Campaign was struggling to gain traction. King felt the weight of all of it, felt the burden of trying to lead a movement that was evolving in directions he could not fully control. But even in his exhaustion and discouragement, he pushed forward. He continued traveling, speaking, organizing. He continued articulating a vision of justice that encompassed not just civil rights, but human rights. Not just legal equality, but economic opportunity. Not just American freedom, but global peace. He was expanding his understanding of what the movement needed to become, even as he sensed that he might not live to see the fulfillment of that vision. In early 1968, as King prepared for the Poor People's Campaign, word came from Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation workers, almost all of them black men, had gone on strike for better wages and working conditions. 2 workers had been crushed to death in a garbage truck accident caused by faulty equipment. The workers were organizing, demanding recognition of their union, carrying signs that read, "I am a man." They asked King to come support their struggle. King had been to Memphis before and did not particularly want to return. But the sanitation workers' strike embodied everything he had been talking about: the intersection of race and class, the dignity of labor, the demand for economic as well as political justice. Their signs declaring, "I am a man," spoke to the fundamental issue at the heart of all his work: the recognition of human dignity. He agreed to go. Late March 1968, King could not shake a feeling of foreboding. The threats against his life had multiplied. His staff begged him to accept more security, but he refused. He said he could not live behind walls of protection while asking others to risk themselves. He had walked too many dangerous roads, faced too many hostile crowds, spent too many nights in jail to start being cautious now. But something felt different about Memphis. The darkness that had sometimes shadowed King's spirit seemed to deepen. He spoke to his staff about death more frequently, not in a morbid way, but as if trying to prepare them for something he sensed was coming. The man who had started as a young preacher in Montgomery, who had led a revolution in non-violence, who had dreamed on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, was walking toward his final appointment with history.
Chapter 9. Memphis, April 1968. The rain came down in sheets as Martin Luther King Jr.'s plane circled Memphis on the evening of April 3, 1968. Lightning split the sky and turbulence rocked the aircraft. Some passengers gasped as the plane bounced through the storm. King sat quietly, his face calm despite the rough flight. He had never been afraid of flying, but lately death seemed to hover near him more persistently, a presence he acknowledged without surrendering to fear. Memphis was not where King wanted to be that night. He was tired, worn down by years of constant struggle, burdened by the weight of leading a movement that seemed to be fracturing. The Poor People's Campaign demanded his attention. Plans needed to be finalized. People needed to be organized. But the sanitation workers of Memphis had asked for his help, and he could not refuse them. Their strike embodied everything he believed in: the dignity of labor, the connection between economic and racial justice, the courage of ordinary people standing up for their rights. The strike had begun in February after two black sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death when the garbage truck they were sheltering in during a rainstorm malfunctioned. The city offered their families nothing, no compensation, no recognition of the loss. It was the final insult after years of degrading treatment. The workers, who earned poverty wages and worked in dangerous conditions, organized under the banner of Local 1733 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. They walked off the job carrying signs that read, "I am a man," 3 words that captured the essence of their demand: recognition of their humanity. Psychologist response was typical of Southern officials facing black protest. Mayor Henry Loeb refused to negotiate seriously. Police broke up peaceful marches with violence. The city obtained injunctions against protests. When King had come to Memphis on March 18th to lead a march, it had ended in chaos after some young people broke windows and looted stores. King was devastated. The march was supposed to demonstrate the power of non-violence, but it had devolved into exactly the kind of violence he had spent his life opposing. Critics pounced on the failed march as evidence that King had lost control of the movement, that his philosophy of non-violence was outdated and ineffective. King himself was shaken. He had left Memphis immediately after the riot, but he knew he had to return. He had to prove that non-violent protest could still work, that the movement had not abandoned its moral foundation. So, despite his exhaustion, despite the threats, despite his premonitions, he came back to Memphis. That night at Mason Temple, thousands of people packed the church despite the storm. They had come through the rain and lightning to hear their prophet speak. When King arrived, he could feel their expectation, their need for reassurance and inspiration. Had not prepared a formal speech. He was tired and had planned to let Ralph Abernathy speak in his place. But when he saw the crowd, he knew he had to give them what they needed. He spoke for over 40 minutes, his voice building from a low rumble to a rolling thunder that matched the storm outside. He talked about the long history of struggle, about how every movement for justice had faced opposition. He talked about the sanitation workers and their courage. He talked about the importance of economic justice, of recognizing that it did no good to integrate lunch counters if you could not afford to buy a hamburger. Then, near the end of the speech, something shifted. His voice took on a different quality, becoming more intimate, more prophetic. He told the crowd that he had been to the mountaintop. He said that, like anybody, he would like to live a long life, but that he was not concerned about that now. He said he just wanted to do God's will, and that God had allowed him to go up to the mountain and look over and see the promised land. His voice cracked with emotion as he continued. He said he might not get there with them, but that they, as a people, would reach the promised land. Tears streamed down the faces of many in the congregation. Something in his words felt final, like a man preparing to say goodbye. He concluded by saying he was not fearing any man,
that his eyes had seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The church erupted in applause and tears, but beneath the celebration was a current of fear. Many felt they had just heard a eulogy delivered by the man it would be for. The next morning, April 4th, dawned clear and warm. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and the sky blue. King and his staff were staying at the Laureate Motel, a black-owned establishment in Memphis where they had stayed on previous visits. He spent the day in meetings, planning for the march they would lead on Monday to demonstrate that non-violence could still be effective in Memphis. He made phone calls, consulted with lawyers, talked strategy with his advisors. As evening approached, King and Ralph Abernathy prepared to go to dinner at the home of Reverend Billy Kyles. They were running late as usual. King was meticulous about his appearance and spent extra time getting ready. The staff joked with him about his vanity, the teasing familiar and affectionate. The mood was lighter than it had been in days. Maybe Memphis would work out after all. Maybe the next march would be peaceful and successful. Maybe they could still prove that non-violence was the way forward. Around 6 in the evening, King stepped onto the balcony outside his room, number 306 on the second floor of the motel. The balcony overlooked the parking lot, where his associates were gathered below. Reverend Samuel Kyles was waiting to take them to dinner. King leaned over the railing and called down to Ben Branch, a musician who was planning to play at the rally that night. He asked Branch to play "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" and to play it beautifully. It was one of his favorite hymns, a song about being led through the storm to the light. Across the street, in a rooming house that backed up to Mulberry Street, a man looked through a rifle scope. James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal who had escaped from Missouri State Prison the previous year, had followed King to Memphis. He had rented a room that afternoon in the boarding house, asking specifically for one with a view of the Laureate Motel. He had spent the day preparing, watching, waiting for his moment. Confiscated at 6:01 p.m., as King stood on that balcony chatting with his friends, a single shot rang out. The bullet struck King in the jaw, severing his spinal cord, tearing through tissue and bone. He fell backward, his hand raised to his face. His associates rushed to the balcony. They found him lying in a pool of blood, a gaping wound in his neck and jaw. He was still breathing but unconscious. Psychologist erupted. People screamed for ambulances. They pointed toward the direction the shot had come from. Ralph Abernathy cradled King's head, talking to his friend even though he received no response. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived. They rushed King to St. Joseph's Hospital, but everyone who saw the wound knew the truth. The injury was catastrophic. No one could survive such trauma. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The prophet who had called a nation to live up to its ideals, the preacher who had articulated dreams of justice and freedom, the non-violent warrior who had led a revolution without firing a shot, was gone. A single bullet from a racist's gun had accomplished what years of threats, bombings, beatings, and FBI harassment could not. It had silenced the voice that America most needed to hear. News of the assassination spread across the nation with terrible speed. In cities from coast to coast, rage and grief exploded into violence. Buildings burned, windows shattered, looters took to the streets. More than 40 people died in the riots that followed King's murder. It was the kind of violence he had spent his life trying to prevent, but his death unleashed it anyway. The irony was bitter. The prophet of non-violence became a martyr whose death sparked the very violence he had preached against. Confiscated James Earl Ray fled Memphis, beginning a 2-month international manhunt. He was finally captured at Heathrow Airport in London on June 8th, trying to board a plane to Brussels with a false Canadian passport. He eventually pleaded guilty to King's murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later, he would recant his confession, claiming he had been set up, that he was a patsy in a larger conspiracy. To this day, Some question whether Ray acted alone or whether he was part of a plot involving others, possibly including government agencies. But no credible evidence of a conspiracy has ever been produced, and multiple investigations have concluded that Ray was the gunman. On April 9th, Martin Luther King Jr. was laid to rest after a funeral service at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. 100,000 people followed his coffin through the streets of the city where he had been born. The coffin was carried on a simple farm wagon pulled by 2 mules, a symbol of the poor people he had dedicated his final years to helping. Presidents, governors, and celebrities attended. But the people who truly mourned him were the thousands of ordinary Black Americans who had followed his leadership, who had believed in his dream, who had trusted his guidance. Benjamin Mays, the Morehouse College president who had been King's mentor, delivered the eulogy. He spoke of King's courage, his commitment to justice, his unwavering faith in non-violence. He said that if King had to die, there was no greater cause for which to give one's life than fighting for a just wage for garbage collectors. The words captured the arc of King's evolution, from fighting legal segregation to fighting economic exploitation, from challenging Southern racism to confronting American militarism and capitalism. Coretta Scott King sat with her 4 children, composed in her grief, strong in the face of unimaginable loss. She would spend the rest of her life protecting her husband's legacy, building institutions to honor his memory, speaking out on the issues he cared about. The children would grow up without their father, their memories of him shaped by photographs and recordings, by stories others told, by the weight of a legacy they never asked to carry. President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. He ordered flags flown at half-staff. But he also pushed through the Fair Housing Act, legislation that had been stalled in Congress. King's assassination created the political will to pass a law prohibiting discrimination in housing, the issue that had brought King to Chicago and exposed Northern racism. The law would not have passed without his death. It was a bitter victory, progress purchased with the blood of the prophet. In Memphis, the sanitation strike continued. The workers who King had come to support did not give up. With national attention focused on their cause after King's death, they finally won. The city recognized their union and agreed to better wages and working conditions. Those signs reading, "I am a man," had been vindicated, but the man who had stood with them was gone. The motel balcony where King fell became a shrine. The Laureate Motel was eventually transformed into the National Civil Rights Museum, preserving the room where King stayed his final night, the balcony where he stood when the bullet found him. Millions would visit, standing in the spot where a giant was cut down, contemplating what was lost and what endures. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life ended on that balcony in Memphis, but his influence did not. The man was gone, but his words remained, his example persisted, his dream refused to die. From Montgomery to Memphis, from his first sermon to his last speech, he had given everything to the cause of justice. He had been beaten, jailed, stabbed, bombed, and finally shot. But he had never surrendered, never compromised his principles, never chosen the easy path over the right one. And that refusal to give up, that stubborn insistence on justice, even when justice seemed impossible, would echo through the decades to come. Chapter 10. The Dream That Never Dies. Blinked. The night Martin Luther King Jr. died, something broke in America that has never fully healed. Cities burned. Faith in nonviolence wavered. The movement he had led splintered into factions that disagreed about direction and methods. But even as the nation mourned and struggled with his loss, the seeds he had planted continued to grow. The dream he articulated on that August day in Washington, the philosophy of non-violent resistance he had demonstrated from Montgomery to Memphis, the vision of the beloved community he had preached in churches across the South, these did not die with him. His invitations of his assassination there was fear that the Poor People's Campaign went forward under Ralph Abernathy's leadership, bringing thousands to Washington to camp on the National Mall and demand economic justice. But the campaign struggled without King's leadership and strategic vision. It did not achieve its legislative goals, and many saw it as proof that the movement had lost its way. Yet even in that apparent failure, the seeds of future struggles were being planted. The ideas King had articulated in his final years about economic justice and the connections between racism, poverty, and militarism would influence future generations of activists. The immediate legislative legacy was clear. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed segregation in public accommodations and employment discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had secured the franchise for Black Americans. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, passed in the wake of King's assassination, prohibited discrimination in housing. These laws transformed the legal landscape of America, dismantling the formal structures of segregation that had existed since the end of Reconstruction. The South that King had known as a child, with its colored-only signs and rigid racial hierarchy enforced by law, was legally abolished. But King had known that changing laws was only the first step. The deeper work of changing hearts and transforming society remained. And in the decades after his death, the nation would grapple with how to fulfill the promise of those laws, how to move from legal equality to genuine equity, how to address the structural inequalities that laws alone could not fix. Coretta Scott King became the guardian of her husband's legacy. She established the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, creating an institution dedicated to preserving his papers, teaching his philosophy, and continuing his work. She spoke at rallies, wrote books, and became a civil rights leader in her own right, carrying forward the vision she and Martin had shared. She also led the 15-year campaign to establish a national holiday honoring her husband. The fight for Martin Luther King Jr. Day was itself a civil rights struggle. Opponents argued that no one deserved a federal holiday except presidents, that King was too controversial, that his personal flaws disqualified him. The battle revealed how contested King's legacy remained, but Coretta persisted, building a coalition of labor unions, civil rights organizations, and political leaders. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation establishing the third Monday of January as Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The first observance was in 1986. The creation of the holiday was significant beyond its practical meaning of a day off work. It represented America's acknowledgement that a black man, a man who had been jailed and vilified and surveilled by his own government, was worthy of the highest honor the nation could bestow. King became only the third person with a federal holiday named for him, after George Washington and Christopher Columbus. His birthday became a time for service, for reflection on civil rights, for teaching new generations about the struggle that had transformed America. In 1986, the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park was established in Atlanta, preserving his birthplace, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and the King Center. The site became a pilgrimage destination for people from around the world who wanted to understand the movement and honor its leader. In 2011, after decades of planning and fundraising, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C., on the National Mall near the Lincoln Memorial, where he had delivered his dream speech. The 30-foot statue showed King emerging from a mountain of despair, his arms crossed, his gaze steady, facing toward the monuments to Jefferson and Lincoln. But preserving King's memory was complicated by the tension between the sanitized version often presented in schools and media, and the more radical King, who had opposed the Vietnam War, called for economic restructuring, and criticized American capitalism and militarism. The King of the Dream speech, calling for his children to be judged by the content of their character, was easy to celebrate. The King who said that riots are the language of the unheard, who questioned whether America had the moral authority to lead the world, who linked racism to economic exploitation and imperialism, That king was more challenging and more often forgotten. His influence extended far beyond America. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, protesters cited King's philosophy of non-violent resistance. When apartheid ended in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison for opposing that system, credited the American civil rights movement as an inspiration. When the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, young people in Tunisia and Egypt carried signs quoting King. The philosophy of non-violent resistance that Gandhi had pioneered and King had adapted to the American context became a global language of struggle against oppression. In America, new generations of activists picked up the work King had left unfinished. The movement for marriage equality drew inspiration from the civil rights movement's challenge to unjust laws. Environmental justice advocates connected racism to the disproportionate exposure of communities of color to pollution and climate change. Immigrant rights activists employed many of the same tactics of civil disobedience and mass mobilization that King had used. Each generation found in King's example a template for fighting injustice while maintaining moral authority. The Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in 2013 after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer, represented both continuity with and evolution from King's movement. The founders cited King as an influence, while also noting that his philosophy had to be adapted to new circumstances. They organized protests against police violence, systemic racism in criminal justice, and the failure to value black lives. They used social media to organize and spread their message in ways King could never have imagined. Some criticized them for being too confrontational, for not adhering strictly enough to non-violence, echoing the criticisms that had been leveled at King himself during his lifetime. The ongoing struggle over voting rights revealed how incomplete the victories of the 1960s remained. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder, leading to new restrictions on voting in many states. Activists found themselves fighting battles King thought had been won, defending rights that had been secured at tremendous cost. The fight for voting rights that had taken King to Selma had to be waged again in the 21st century, a reminder that progress is never permanent, that rights must be defended in every generation. Economic inequality, the issue King was focusing on when he died, remained a defining challenge. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically in the decades after his death. The black poverty rate improved, but remained roughly double the white poverty rate. The wealth gap between black and white families persisted. The kind of economic restructuring King had called for never happened. Capitalism adapted to formal equality, but maintained systems that concentrated wealth and power in ways that disproportionately affected communities of color. His warnings about militarism also proved prescient. America spent the decades after his death in almost continuous warfare. The Cold War's proxy conflicts, the Gulf War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the ongoing military interventions around the globe. The connection King had drawn between spending on warfare and neglecting domestic needs remained as relevant in the 21st century as it had been when he spoke at Riverside Church. The choice between guns and butter, between funding war machines or fighting poverty, was still being made in favor of military spending. Ignoring these unfinished struggles, King's impact on America was undeniable. The South he was born into, where black people could not vote, could not eat at lunch counters with white people, could not attend the same schools. That South was gone. Black Americans served as mayors, governors, members of Congress. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first black president, an event that would have seemed impossible when King was marching in Montgomery. Obama kept a bust of King in the Oval Office and regularly invoked his legacy. The election was both a fulfillment of King's dream and a reminder of how much remained undone, as Obama faced unprecedented opposition rooted at least partly in racial resentment. On schools across America, children learned about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, about the March on Washington and the Dream speech. King became one of the few historical figures studied by virtually every American student. His words were memorized, his tactics analyzed, his courage celebrated. But this educational embrace sometimes sanitized his message, presenting him as a dreamer rather than a strategist, emphasizing his calls for unity while ignoring his challenges to the economic and political structures that maintained inequality. King's children carried his legacy in different ways. Yolanda became an actress and activist before her untimely death in 2007. Martin Luther King III worked in civil rights and politics. Dexter became a successful actor and filmmaker. Bernice, who was only 5 when her father died, became a minister like her father and grandfather, eventually serving as CEO of the King Center. They each grappled with the burden and privilege of their name, trying to honor their father while forging their own paths. The debates about his personal life, particularly the revelations about infidelity and the discovery of plagiarism in some of his academic work, complicated his legacy without ultimately diminishing it. People came to understand that even heroes are flawed human beings, that moral greatness in one area does not require perfection in all areas, that the measure of a life is not the mistakes made, but the courage shown and the changes achieved. King never claimed to be perfect. He claimed only to be committed to justice and willing to sacrifice for that commitment. 50 years after his death, America gathered again at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis to remember. Thousands came to honor the prophet, to remember his words, to reflect on how far the nation had come and how far it still had to go. The balcony where he fell was decorated with flowers. His final words, asking that precious Lord be played beautifully, were recalled and honored. Old civil rights veterans, their faces lined with age, stood alongside young activists who had not been born when King died, but who carried forward his struggle in new forms. The question that hung over these commemorations was whether King's dream had been achieved or betrayed, whether America had fulfilled his vision or merely paid it lip service. Answer, as with most profound questions, was complicated. Progress was real but incomplete. Legal equality was achieved, but structural inequality persisted. The movement he led had changed America fundamentally, but the beloved community he envisioned remained more aspiration than reality. What endured most powerfully was not any single achievement, but the model he provided of moral leadership, of courage in the face of hatred, of commitment to non-violence, even when violence seemed more expedient, of faith that justice would ultimately prevail, even when the odds seemed impossible. Young people facing injustice in their own time could look to King's example and find both inspiration and instruction. They could see that change was possible, that ordinary people could become extraordinary when they stood together for what was right, that no system of oppression was so powerful that it could not be challenged. The dream King articulated on that August day in 1963 did not die with him on a Memphis balcony. It lived on in the hearts of those he inspired, in the laws he helped change, in the consciousness he helped transform. It lived in every child who grew up believing they deserved equality, regardless of their skin color. It lived in every activist who chose non-violence over violence, who chose dialogue over hatred, who chose hope over despair. It lived in the arc of history that, as he promised, bent slowly but inexorably toward justice. Closing. An eternal flame. Inflate. From a house on Auburn Avenue to a balcony in Memphis. From a young preacher uncertain of his calling to a prophet who changed the world. Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey spanned only 39 years. It seems impossible that one life, cut short in its prime, could accomplish so much. But King did not work alone. He stood at the front of a movement composed of thousands of people whose names history would never record. Ordinary citizens who walked instead of riding buses, who faced fire hoses and dogs, who registered to vote despite intimidation, who believed that America could be better than it was. King's genius was to take their courage and give it direction, to take their anger and channel it into disciplined action, to take their suffering and transform it into moral power that could not be denied. He articulated what they felt in words that made the world listen. He organized their resistance into campaigns that achieved concrete goals. He stood firm when others wavered, calling them back to non-violence and human dignity, even when violence seemed justified and hatred seemed natural. The cost of his leadership was measured in sleepless nights and constant fear, in time away from his family, in the knowledge that every day might be his last. He was stabbed in Harlem and nearly died. His home was bombed while his wife and infant daughter were inside. He was arrested 29 times. The FBI wiretapped his phones and tried to blackmail him into suicide. White supremacists sent death threats by the hundreds. Yet he kept going, kept preaching, kept marching, kept believing that the moral universe bent toward justice, even when all evidence suggested it bent toward chaos and violence. He could have chosen a different life. With his education and gifts, he could have led a comfortable existence as a professor or pastor, speaking about justice from the safety of a pulpit, while others took the risks. But from the moment the Montgomery Improvement Association asked him to lead the bus boycott, he chose the harder path. He chose to be the voice and the target, the symbol and the sacrifice. He chose to offer himself as a lightning rod, knowing that by drawing fire, he might protect others. By speaking truth, he might inspire millions. By suffering, he might transform suffering into something redemptive. Position grew up with a father who was often absent, who belonged more to the movement than to them. Yolanda once asked him why he had to go to jail so often. He tried to explain about injustice and fighting wrongs, but how do you explain to a child that her father might not come home because standing up for what is right is more important than safety? Coretta carried the burden of loving a man marked for death, of raising children who might become orphans, of never knowing if the phone call in the night would bring news of another threat or the final tragedy. The 4 little girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing, Jimmy Lee Jackson shot trying to protect his mother, James Reeb beaten to death for supporting voting rights, Viola Liuzzo murdered while shuttling marchers, and countless others whose names are lost to history. They paid the ultimate price. King lived with the knowledge that his campaigns put others in danger, that every march he led might result in someone's death. The weight of that responsibility never left him. In his final years, he spoke more often about death, seemed to sense it approaching, made peace with it in a way that allowed him to keep working even as the threats intensified. On that balcony in Memphis, as the sun set on April 4, 1968, the assassin's bullet ended a life, but not a legacy. King had always known this moment might come. He had prepared his followers for it, telling them that if something happened to him, others would take his place, that the movement was larger than any individual. He was right. The movement continued, evolving and adapting, fracturing and reforming, but continuing. His birthday became a day of service, his words became curriculum in schools, his image became iconic. But more important than the memorials and holidays was the transformation he helped bring about in American consciousness. The nation that had accepted segregation as normal in 1955 rejected it as immoral by 1968. The white moderate, who King had criticized as the greatest obstacle to justice, began, slowly and incompletely, to recognize the moral claims of the civil rights movement. America's original sin of racism was not erased, but it could no longer hide behind the pretense of separate but equal. The lessons he taught resonate beyond the specific context of the civil rights movement. The principle that non-violent resistance could defeat institutionalized evil inspired movements around the world. The strategy of appealing to the conscience of the oppressor while building power among the oppressed became a template for liberation struggles. The faith that suffering could be redemptive, that unearned suffering was redemptive, gave courage to people facing overwhelming force. The vision of the beloved community, where former oppressors and formerly oppressed could live together as brothers and sisters, offered hope that reconciliation was possible even after generations of hatred. We live today in a world King helped create, but which falls short of the one he envisioned. Racial inequality persists in employment, education, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice. Economic inequality has widened to levels that would have appalled him. Militarism remains a defining feature of American power. The work he died doing, organizing poor people across racial lines to demand economic justice, remains unfinished. The beloved community exists more in aspiration than in reality. Consciousness, when people around the world face injustice, they still reach for the tools King helped sharpen. Nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, moral witness, appeals to conscience, organized mass action. When they need inspiration, they still turn to his words, finding in his speeches a combination of righteous anger and redemptive hope that speaks across decades and continents. When they doubt whether change is possible, they remember Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma. Remember that a preacher from Atlanta and thousands of ordinary people changed laws and hearts that had seemed unchangeable. Renegotiate Luther King Jr. stands now in marble on the National Mall, his image frozen in stone, his words etched nearby. But his true memorial is not made of granite and bronze. It is made of every person who refuses to accept injustice, who chooses courage over fear, who believes that moral force can overcome physical force. It is made of every march for justice, every protest against oppression, every voice raised in defense of human dignity. It is made of every generation that takes up the unfinished work, that refuses to be satisfied with the status quo, that insists that the arc of history must bend toward justice, because they are willing to grab hold and pull. From Auburn Avenue to the ages, from one man to millions, from a dream spoken into the August air to a vision that continues to call America toward its better self, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy lives. Not in perfection achieved, but in struggle continued. Not in battles won, but in courage demonstrated. Not in a destination reached, but in a direction chosen. The prophet is gone, but the prophecy remains. The dreamer is dead, but the dream refuses to die. And as long as people yearn for justice, as long as they believe in the possibility of change, as long as they find strength in non-violence and hope in human dignity, Martin Luther King Jr. will live. The eternal flame at his tomb in Atlanta burns day and night, a symbol of a light that will never be extinguished. But the true flame is not in Atlanta. It burns in the hearts of all who heard his call and answered it, who heard his dream and made it their own, who heard his challenge and accepted it. That flame, lit in Montgomery and carried across the South and to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and finally to Memphis, passed from his hands to ours. The work continues. The dream endures. The struggle for justice goes on. And the words he spoke on that mountaintop echo still. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.